Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This video is an entry in a new series on this channel, which I'll be adding to every now and again between my larger videos. The idea of the series is to give a brief overview, a review and summary of a work that I consider important for people to understand. This time I'll be looking at a famous lecture given by Isaiah Berlin, Two Concepts of Liberty. Born in Riga, Latvia in 1909, then a part of the Russian Empire, Berlin lived in St. Petersburg, then known as Petrograd, at the time of the revolutions that established communist rule over Russia, and his family moved to Britain in 1921 to avoid persecution. A significant contributor to Western thought, he is most well known for the lecture that is the subject of this video. The lecture was given in 1958 as an inaugural speech accepting the position of Chair of Social and Political Theory at Oxford, which had been granted to Berlin the year previous. So, what was said in this lecture? The printed version of the lecture that I used as a source stretches over 54 pages, including 9 parts. That's an intro and 8 titled sections, or chapters if you like. It's short and readily available at libraries, so I'd encourage you to give it a read yourself when you can. What I'll do now is go through these parts and briefly explain what Berlin is expressing in each. We'll pick up the full picture again later, but you'll likely see it being formed as we go. In the intro, Berlin sets the theme of his speech, stating that he'll be talking about freedom or liberty, and that he does so in an environment of an open war between ideologies. That is, the Cold War that occupied the second half of the 20th century between the liberal democracies on one hand and the communist world on the other. He gives a short definition of both positive and negative liberties, but more importantly at this stage, he mentions that there are more than 200 senses of liberty, and that he will examine no more than 2 of these senses. This point is easily forgotten as we move through the main body of his lecture, so I just ask you to keep it in mind. In Chapter 1, Berlin gives us a fleshed out definition of what he means by negative liberty. He traces the concept out of the liberal tradition, citing thinkers like J.S. Mill and Benjamin Constant for providing the idea that the liberty of some must depend on the restraint of others. Here we get the reason it is called negative liberty. It is by negating the influence or imposition of others upon ourselves that we can realise our freedom. Berlin states, "The defence of liberty consists in the negative goal of warding off interference." He goes on to associate this type of freedom with every plea for civil liberties and individual rights, but also is clear that it is not exactly equatable with democracy, and could even find expression within autocratic rule. Chapter 2 sees Berlin's definition of positive liberty. If negative was freedom from the interference of others, then positive is freedom to become a person that you wish to become. As Berlin states, "The positive sense of the word liberty derives from the wish on the part of the individual to be his own master. I wish my life and decision to depend on myself, not on external forces of whatever kind." It is positive liberty because in it we posit a version of self that we aim towards. That quick and easy definition put forward, Berlin doesn't take long before he starts to express a distaste for this type of liberty. The larger and latter part of this chapter discusses the criticisms of positive liberty that occupy the following chapters. So let's just move on to those chapters. In the 3rd chapter, Berlin highlights the self-suppressing nature of positive liberty. That is to say, that in positing an ideal life for ourselves, we recognise that the person that we are now is not meeting that ideal. We identify the person we wish to become as our real selves, and yet live in a life that doesn't reach that ideal. We are then suppressing the person we are in favour of the person we wish to become. In Berlin's words, "The psychological experience of observing myself yielding to some lower impulse, acting from a motive that I dislike, or of doing something which at the very moment of doing I may detest, and reflecting later that I was not myself or not in control of myself when I did it, belongs to this way of thinking and speaking. I identify myself with my critical and rational moments." So we see ourselves as that thoughtful analysis of our actions, and the thing that acts is to be strictly controlled, base impulses suppressed. Chapter 4 seems to concede that this self-mastery, when leading to new abilities or skills, can be an expression of liberty. Self-mastery can become self-realization. A skilled musician operates her instrument without the impediment of ignorance. She creates her music freely. Berlin appears to be asserting here that knowledge and its acquisition is the function of self-realization, that acquiring knowledge is how we remove the impediments to our free action, or how we come to realize an impediment is impossible to remove. In Chapter 5, Berlin makes an explicit connection between authoritarian paternalism and positive liberty. In suppressing the base impulses in ourselves and by deferring to that rational part of us to discover our truest wishes, by recognizing that self-realization is a victory of knowledge over ignorance, that self-mastery is a victory of one worthy self over another unworthy self, we open the door for the self-righteous to become the tyrannous. As a caricature of positive liberty, he states, "A rational or free state would be a state governed by such laws as all rational men would freely accept." And again, freedom is not freedom to do what is irrational or stupid or bad. To force empirical selves into the right pattern is no tyranny, but liberation. Berlin is suggesting that this is where positive liberty leads, from self-mastery to paternalism, and he sees this impulse to control in the dictators of his time. Chapter 6 covers the notion of recognition as liberty. That is to say, to what extent is being treated as an end, a necessary and maybe even fundamental part of freedom. He uses this context to make a fresh attack on paternalism, which he views as not affording appropriate recognition to individuals. Yet, he also makes an interesting point about how the yoke of a brutal tyranny from one who recognises you as equal but enslaved may be preferable in the search for recognition to living under a gentle ruler who also infantilises, or in some way considers you lesser. The goal of this chapter, however, seems to be to reinforce the notion of negative liberty, associating that struggle for recognition with the freedom from interference by others, as he did in terms of the struggle for civil liberties earlier in Chapter 1. No doubt every interpretation of the word liberty, he says, however unusual, must include a minimum of what I have called negative liberty. Following that assertion, Chapter 7 makes some attempt to clarify what a free society based on the principles of negative liberty might look like. It is not simply democracy. Equality of the right to oppress or interfere is not equivalent to liberty. It is a balance between laws and free actions, and must establish a society in which there must be some frontiers of freedom which nobody should ever be permitted to cross. It is a society in which an individual should possess rights over structured powers, for example, the right to legal equity, over and above the power of a judge to judge. In the final chapter, Berlin makes explicit what has been an undercurrent throughout much of the lecture. The idea that there is a single correct way to live life, and that once found for the self, it can be exported and imposed on others for their benefit. This monistic view of human values is simply wrong. There is a plurality of values across any group of peoples, and they will often conflict. Conflicts of values may be an intrinsic, irremovable element in human life. This is the root for his preference of negative liberty. He should, ideally, allow that expression of personal values, without interference from the values of others. It is truer because it recognises the fact that human goals are many, not all of them commensurable, and in perpetual rivalry with one another. So, having looked at each chapter as they come, let's now put together the narrative that Berlin is presenting, as I do believe this work possesses a clear narrative. As a headline of the piece, it's often stated that this work is simply about two types of freedom, and how one type is better than the other. That is in this work, sure. Berlin is quite clear that he has a preference for negative liberty, and much of the lecture is occupied by a criticism of positive liberty. He associates, at the outset, negative liberty with the liberal democracies of his time, and positive liberty with the communist dictatorships, and therefore his preference is often taken as an explicit criticism of communism. But he doesn't only criticise positive liberty, and occasionally spares some words to suggest that there is value in it too. He says some interesting things about freedom, about liberty, but it can never be claimed that he is giving a full analysis of freedom. By his own reckoning, he is speaking about only 2 from over 200 types of freedom. If this lecture was about defining freedom effectively, then he wouldn't limit his discussion in this way. Despite the title then, this is not a lecture strictly about the topic of liberty. So, what is the lecture about then? Well, I think the full theme of the lecture becomes explicit only in the final chapter, when Berlin covers his notion of values pluralism. Viewed through the lens of an anti-monistic and pro-pluralistic approach to human values, i.e. what is good or bad for the self and for others, that the final chapter presents to us, we can see that the assessment of positive liberty has always been in service to making the simple point that the correct life for one is not the correct life for all. His distaste for, or distrust of, positive liberty seems to come from his belief that it often informs a paternalist outlook. In assessing and then deciding on the correct path through life for oneself, we may insist that it is the correct way of life for others too. We readily impose the rational self upon that acting self, and that imposition becomes a judgment of superiority that can easily be applied to others. So that's where I will leave Isaiah Berlin for now. Before I go, I will mention that there has been a lot of debate about this lecture over the years, with some criticisms levelled against it from all angles. You'll find some further reading in the description box below the video. I think that Charles Taylor's essay, What's Wrong with Negative Liberty, is an excellent addendum to the lecture, even if Berlin's assertion that he speaks of only 2 from 200 types of liberty makes him difficult to pin down on the issue of liberty and his definitions of it. George Crowder's Liberty and Pluralism is a useful resource in examining the entirety of Berlin's work and gets my recommendation too. Two Concepts of Liberty is an important work even after the end of the Cold War that so obviously informed its topic. It asks us to examine, if even just at a basic level, what is freedom or liberty? What does my freedom mean for others? When someone offers freedom, it should lead us to ask, what type of freedom are you offering? But most importantly, at least in my opinion, this lecture is an assertion that we each have our own values unique to us, and imposing those values on others is a kind of tyranny. Thanks for watching.